We're going to talk about chairs today. A lot. But stick with us because after today's episode, you'll never be able to look at a chair in quite the same way again, or perhaps even your life and faith. So get ready, listen up, and don't forget to take a seat.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Well, we have back with us on Signs of the Times Radio today Nathan Brown, who's a regular writer in the magazine and has also been on the podcast and radio show before. Welcome back, Nathan.
Yeah, good to be back. Thank you.
Excellent. So I think last time we talked, it was about basketball, if I'm not wrong, and how active you are. And
one there.
Yeah, that's right.
Last time we were talking about refugees.
Oh, refugees. That's right. The time before that, it was basketball.
Time before that, it was basketball. We're multifaceted folks.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So with the basketball thing, you were telling us about how despite the fact that you're in your 40s, you're active, you're getting out there, you're slam dunking that ball.
Not quite.
not quite.
We're running up and down.
Running up and down. But this time you want to talk to us about sitting around on chairs. So that's very interesting. This kind of reminds me of when I was doing my social science degree and we were going through philosophy class and talking about Plato and his idea of ideal types versus reality, the allegory of the cave, blah blah blah, all this philosophy stuff. And what is the essence of a chair was the example given. And
that's right.
And when I saw you'd written this article, which is entitled Trusting Faith, that's here in the January-February edition of Science magazine, I wondered if that's where you were going. But you are talking about the theory of the chair, but you went in a bit of a different direction. What is it with you and chairs, Nathan Brown?
Well, we all use them pretty regularly, and some of us probably use them far too often. If people like my friend Dr. Darren Morton would have the chance to get a voice in here, he'd be telling us, that sitting is the new smoking and we need to be all much more active than we are.
Yeah.
So chairs are something that we're all familiar with and some of us too familiar with. So, it's just finding that simple thing that is a part of our everyday lives and also that chairs come in so many different shapes and sizes, which is, we use one single word that can describe so many different things. So that's a fascinating place to start as well.
Yeah, all the way from a sort of an old antique wooden kitchen chair all the way through to a Jason recliner sort of thing.
Yeah, and so many things in between. And, you go into even so many different sizes. You go into a little kid's classroom and try and sit on one of their tiny little plastic chairs. And, you realize that chairs fit different people at different stages of life and in different circumstances in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting because, like you say, this is a very commonplace object that we have in our houses, we have in our places of work or entertainment or anything. Chairs are everywhere and yet we don't often think about it, but you could. There are lots of different angles and ways to think about a chair. You ran through a few in your article. Can you give us a sort of a sneak peek of those?
Well, and a part of it was inspired by a friend of mine who, at the time that I was writing this article, was very excited because he was going to spend a week at a chair-making course.
As one does.
As you do. And so he actually travelled down from New South Wales to Victoria to a place down here where he could spend a week working with some master craftsmen in hand making a wooden chair. And all the different parts of the process. And of course, he was just, he was someone, to pay to spend a week doing that. You've got to be pretty into it for a start.
Yeah.
And then of course, when he came back from it, he just had all the stories and the explanations and the photos. And I got to sit on the chair that he made. So, it was an interesting experience to think about so much thought going into a very common household item.
Well, you would have to put a lot of thought into it, wouldn't you? Because because first of all, from an engineering point of view, it's got to be strong enough, and then from an aesthetic point of view, it's got to be nice to look at, and then from an ergonomic point of view, it's got to be comfortable to sit on, and that basically results in a lot of different skills, coming to fore. I mean, getting all the angles right, and then the joints, and then possibly some wood turning if you want sort of round decorative sort of. Yeah, but it's a complex business. So chair's actually quite a challenge to make, I imagine.
Yeah, well, certainly when you're making it by hand in that kind of way, using hand tools, and it's quite a work of art in that way. And so, I got to appreciate chairs in a whole new way just through the experience of this friend of mine. So that was a little bit that was in the back of my mind, or one of my starting points when I was writing this article was, we take chairs so much for granted that we don't often think about it when we wander into a room and sit down. We don't stop and check the chair as if it's going to hold our weight, or, it's just one of those things that's there in our house or there in our office or wherever we might be. So ubiquitous, so multifaceted, but also so complicated in a sense. In the article, I go through a number of different ways that we can think about a chair. You can think about it as this physical object that's in your house, but also what it's made from, the history of it, why it's the shape that it is. And, a lot of times things like this in our homes have some, long history of why they're the height they are, why they're the shape they are. All of those kind of things draw on a long tradition. Even if they're mass-produced these days, a chair is a certain height off the ground because that's kind of what fits for the average-sized human being. And so, and sometimes I get reminded of this in chairs on aeroplanes, that I'm a little bit taller than average. And so those chairs sometimes don't fit me quite as well as they would someone who's a more average size.
So it's a question of if you end up with your knees around your ears or your feet dangling off the ground sort of thing.
That's right. And that's not comfortable, and so it doesn't work particularly. If the chair's too high or too low, if you have to sit on it for too long, it can become quite uncomfortable. So the reason the chair is a certain size and shape and all those kind of things is, there's a reason for it. And somewhere along the way, somebody actually experimented and came up with that idea. So there's a lot of history in a chair, and even just in the phenomenon of the chair. But if you want to look at a particular chair, you can also have, your grandma's rocking chair that has been handed down through generations that has a particular history as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Or you see those antique shows where there's some, very informed person who says, oh, yes, this is a Queen Anne chair from the whatever century, and these were typical and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, wow, and this is the timber and this is and they just know all about it just by looking at the shape of it. Or this is some avant-garde designer from 1973 and wow, this is amazing example.
No one would ever want to sit on it, but it looks pretty cool.
That's right. So if you're listening to this podcast, you're thinking, what the heck are they doing talking about chairs for so long? I mean, have a little faith and hold on, because this is going somewhere. So continue, Nathan.
So you can look at it from the history and whatever of the chair, and as I said, how it's been made, the wood or the plastic or the fabric or whatever it is that is being put together to be that chair. But then you can also look at it from the physics of the chair. The reality of a chair is that it's a lightweight way to make a platform a certain distance off the ground that someone can sit upon and not fall over. And probably the simplest way to create a seat that somebody could sit on would be, cut a cross section of a log at the right height, and you could sit on that.
Yep.
But it's not very transportable. It's very heavy for the weight that it is. And so we've come up with this idea that if we just get this little platform, this little, very relatively thin cross-section of seat, and then put legs at its four corners, then that's a much more transportable way to sit on that same platform at that same height. Yeah, I've obviously overthought this.
Yes.
So, there's the physics of just overcoming gravity by making a platform you can sit on at a certain height off the ground that will be stable and won't fall over. But then you put a back on it, and so you lean on it. You can lean back on it, which makes it a little bit more comfortable. You don't have to support all your weight in that way. But then you start working with things like levers, that the pressure that you're putting by leaning back, is that going to be counterbalanced by the weight of you sitting down on it? And all these things go into the physics of, a chair.
And the engineering, I guess.
That's right. And so anybody that's sat on a variety of chairs, that actually some chairs are less stable than others. And all of those things are actual physics in action.
Yeah.
We learn physics in high school and then kind of think, well, now I have to get on with life and get a job. But the realities of some of those things are day-to-day realities in something as simple as a chair. Forces overcoming gravity that are then counterbalanced and all of those kind of things that holds a weight in place. So, we can get all scientific and physical in this sense.
Yep. Or historical and aesthetic, as you said before.
That's right. And so another way to think about it is the human mechanics of sitting in a chair. So then we get on to physiology. There are various ways of thinking about that. And, I'm not a human physiologist, but, the reality of what it does to your body when you're sitting in a certain way. And if you're scrunched up, you're far less comfortable compared to, being able to lean back a little bit or, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Nathan, have you ever tried one of those, I don't know if it's called a chair or a stool or a completely different word, but it's a sort of an alternative to a chair where you're sort of semi-kneeling on a pad, and then you lean back and your bum is sort of on a bit of a tilted sort of platform, and it has the effect of improving your posture. It was a bit of a thing in the sort of 80s, I think, probably the 70s and 80s. It was very cool, very ergonomic. Ever tried one of those?
Yeah, a little bit. And I guess the other thing that people have done in a similar kind of way have been the old balance balls.
Oh, yes, of course.
That was a trend for a while, was that you wouldn't have a chair, you'd have one. And so, of course, you're exercising all your core muscles just by sitting there because you need to maintain your balance on something that absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of muscular work as human beings, as physical bodies sitting in a chair. There's a lot of things going on just in that process.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, there's so many ways we can think about a chair.
Yep.
And probably, I think there's probably, as you've mentioned, there'd be some listeners here just going, get over yourself, fellas.
That's all right. It's a chair, for goodness sake. Yeah.
It's a chair. And I guess this is what to some extent is the point of what the article is about is, so we can come up with all these theories and all of them are true and valuable and actually can help us understand and appreciate a chair more.
And even interesting to some people from some points of view.
Yeah, that's right. And some people would have different interests in different aspects of it. My friend who wanted to make chairs, that's a different interest to an exercise physiologist or a physiotherapist who's interested in how you sit and what it does for your posture and, whether you sit too long and you need to get up and walk around every few minutes to stay a little bit healthier and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, sure.
So if we put all these things together, do we come up with some kind of super theory of a chair?
Oh, the grand unifying theory of the chair.
The grand unifying theory of a chair. Again, people would get to the point of eye rolling and just say, yeah, good on you. The ultimate point of a chair is to sit down.
Yeah.
And so it's not to come up with the grand theory of a chair. And if you're standing around looking at the chair to come up with this theory, you're actually not using the chair with what it's for.
So
you're missing the point.
You've got the coffee table of the chair there, and you're flipping through the glossy pages and admiring the art, but you're doing it from a standing position while an actual chair sits in the corner of the room unused. I mean, it's the point of the chair is to be sat on, and if to be interested in a chair is, well, that's all very fascinating, but unless you actually park yourself on it, take a seat, it's a fairly point. You've missed the point. Exactly. Yeah.
And some of these things can be important. To have a more comfortable chair can actually make it a better experience.
Yeah, sure.
And to ensure that it's a chair that won't. I was recently at a concert watching a musician perform just a couple of weeks ago. She pulled in the piano stool and one leg gave way.
Oh, wow.
And that's not a good thing in the middle of a musical performance. And no one was harmed in the making of this illustration. They had to dash around and find her something else to sit on. And so there's that basic thing that it's not a good idea just to dismiss all of this theory and just sit on something that if it doesn't support you, you'll find yourself on a heap in a heap on the floor pretty quickly.
Okay, all right.
So there's a basic level that you need to kind of engage with thinking about a chair.
Yeah. And I guess there are a lot of other things in life that are similar. I mean, you publish books, and I think of one you did, was it last year or 2017? Sue Rad's Food as Medicine, for example.
Yeah.
So this is a book full of, great healthy recipes and incredible food pictures, and you can flip through and wow, it's incredible. You could do amazing things with that. You could translate it into Portuguese. You could memorize the recipes, and that'd be some sort of savant sort of ability that you demonstrate by doing that. You could get the first printing and sort of keep it as a collector's item. You could do a lot of things with that book. But unless you actually open that recipe, put it on your kitchen bench and say, right, we start with 3 cups of quinoa, then there's not a whole lot of point in having it. It's a recipe book is there in order to help you make food and then eat it, and it's not being used for its primary purpose. Or sheet music, for example. Wow, what incredible sheet music! Oh, this is done by Bach, and this is the history and this is the story behind it, and there's some interesting sort of musical dynamics going through this, and it's interesting how it changes key here. But I mean, unless you actually pull out your instrument and follow those dots on the page and play the note, you play those notes so that people can actually hear the result, then you're not
doing music.
Yeah, you're not doing music. Yeah, and you're not you're not using that sheet music, that manuscript, for the primary purpose for which it was designed. And I guess there are a lot of things in life like that, aren't there?
Yeah. Your analogy with Food as Medicine reminds me of my favorite review that we got of that book, which was by it was kind of a translation of, I think it was published in Swedish or Norwegian, a review of Food as Medicine as the cookbook, which described it as so large and impressive as it's almost like a piece of furniture for your kitchen.
Wow.
So the analogy fits. but your point is exactly right, and getting it, landing this back in the direction of faith, that the point of faith is living. It's not theories. I mean, so much when we even say the word faith, we start immediately talking about theology or philosophy. We could get into the history of it. We could get into the minutiae of, how it works, or, arguing about some of these kind of things. The reality is that if you find something that looks like a faith that, again, just taking that quick survey of the chair, does this look like something that's going to hold me up? Mm-hmm. And the point is then to take a seat. And so faith is something to be put into practice in our lives. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we kind of just spend our lives circling, trying to explain it, trying to argue about it, trying to convince ourselves about it, because you can have all the answers. You can have, as you say, you can have memorized all the recipes in the book, but until you eat something, you haven't tasted it. You haven't used it for the purpose that it was designed for.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of something says in the Bible, like, taste and see that the Lord is good. You need to actually, taste in order to figure out if, is this recipe any good or not? You've got to taste it. And I guess it's the same with faith. It's the same with God. We can, like you say, we can theorize about it. We can write books about it. We can read books about it. But until we actually make it real, make it practical in our lives, we're not actually using our faith, using our spirituality for the fundamental purpose for which it exists.
Yeah, and from the perspective of a Christian faith, the core of our faith is Jesus. And so we can speculate, we can argue, we can memorize, we can all of these kind of things about him, about his place in history, about the theological significance, and argue about trinities and incarnations and all of these big words, or substitutions or atonements or whatever. The reality is there comes a point where we either choose to live our lives of someone who follows Jesus or we don't.
Yeah.
And it comes to the point, and for me, this is why the teachings of Jesus, and I'm not trying to discount some of the other aspects of the Jesus event or the Jesus, the significance of that for Christian history can't be downplayed or Christian understanding cannot be downplayed in any way. But when we get to the teachings of Jesus that are practical about how we live our lives, and this is where we've got to get to the point of saying, what if Jesus, because of who we believe he is and was, because we believe what we believe about the significance of, what that whole story is about, what if Jesus actually knows more about how to live life than we do?
Mm.
And so we start to take seriously some of the things that he's taught, and this is where we can actually road test this.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that if you follow everything by the book that life will go swimmingly from here on, because Jesus actually said, well, it's not that simple, and there are, if you follow me, it's not necessarily the easiest way to live life, but there's a coherence to life that comes with it that, is this organizing principle around which we can order our lives. Often when people sit down with me and say, hey, I want to write a book, this is what I'd like to do. And they give me this brief overview of this idea for a book. And, it's my job as a book editor to listen to people in that situation and to, see how I might be able to encourage them or help them in that process. So one of the key questions I'll ask them is, what is the key person that you would like your book to be for? Who's the person you would like to read that book? And I don't mean, most authors would say, I want everybody in the world to read my book.
Of course they do, yes.
That's not a good answer.
Yep.
Because if you try and write a book for everybody in the world, nobody will want to read it.
Yeah.
But if you write a book for one person, the chances are there'll be lots of other one persons who will want to read it as well. And so if you have a strong idea of who that one person is, every time you have to make a decision about how I tell this story, or do I put this part of the, how would I explain this to that person, there's something to make that decision about. So it makes the process of writing the book easier because there is always a rationale for making really a book is a long line of decisions that you need to make, choices between, what you put in, what you leave out, how you tell it, how you don't tell it, all of those kind of things. And so I think that following Jesus in this way is that one thing that we can center our lives on that then is the reason for making all those other decisions.
Okay, so you're saying it's in a similar way that if you're writing a book, you're focusing on that one person and you're deciding, like at each stage, what to leave in, what to leave out, which direction to go as you're writing. Yeah. It's similar in the way that we live our lives. If we live our lives directed at one person and that person is Jesus Christ, we decide in the light of his response what to do, what not to do, and what decisions to make, what direction to take. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. Now, we need to choose who that one person is pretty carefully.
Yeah.
If that's the thing we're going to organise our lives around, and for various reasons, and we could, that's a whole other series of articles, is why we would choose Jesus to be that person.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that all decisions are easy, because some of the decisions will actually be very hard, but you have the reason for making that decision.
Sure. Hey, Nathan, it's interesting that you're saying this, because just yesterday I was doing a bit of proofreading for Adventist Record magazine, and there was an article from you there about, understanding very much what you're saying. What does it mean to live a life of faith? What does it mean to follow, Jesus' commission that he's given to Christians? And you took that right back to Jesus' most famous address, his most famous talk, which is called the Sermon on the Mount, which you can find in the Gospel of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And you said that, hey, if you want to know how to live as a Christian, if you want to live out your life in concert, in harmony with Jesus' teachings, this is where you need to look. And that's got some pretty hard practical stuff in there, hasn't it? And it certainly is practical. It certainly is like trusting faith. And what are some of the things out of the Sermon on the Mount that sort of grab you and make you think, well, yeah, this is actually a practical way to rest the weight of your life in Jesus, in faith in him?
Yeah, and certainly it's no coincidence that this is what I'm talking about now, and that's what I was writing about last week.
Well, that's right. It's uppermost in your mind right now. I'm getting that vibe.
You understand when you write something, it's one of those things that keeps echoing in your head for a little while.
Yeah, sure.
But I definitely think these two ideas are linked, and the Sermon on the Mount is very challenging.
Oh, yeah.
It's not something for the faint-hearted, but when you have that when it's also something you can road test, that you can experiment with. Say, does this actually make sense of life? Does this, is this good? And so that's where faith becomes a practical thing.
Yeah.
When you go to sit yourself on a chair, you might not rest your full weight on it straight away.
Yeah.
You might kind of maintain your balance.
That's right. Gingerly let a little bit of weight on it first. Yeah.
That's right. But as it holds your weight, then you do relax a little bit more into it.
Sure.
And I think that's the experience we can have with experimenting with faith in that way.
So what are some examples in the Sermon on the Mount that I guess you could say, well, hey, you could trust yourself to this? Like you said, some of them are pretty challenging. Some are pretty counterintuitive. So can you give us some practical examples?
Yeah, well, to me, the worst case scenario that Jesus sets out is talking about an enemy and somebody who might be persecuting you.
Yeah.
And Jesus' command, which is a fascinating way of understanding that, is to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah, wow.
Now, that's not an easy thing to do. That's a heavy duty, hardcore, call to live differently. But then when you look around the world and you say, well, where does it get us to hate our enemies and curse those who persecute us?
And take revenge, yeah.
Where does that get us? Well, it gets us in history's endless cycles of violence. And there are just these glimpses, these glimmers of light throughout history where people have loved their enemies and prayed for those who persecuted them, and it has made a difference.
Yeah.
And that's where we see some of the great people of history who have chosen differently, who have chosen to live by that different ethical standard, and that it has transformed human relationships.
Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. come to mind.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's some easy examples to start with. And, this idea of nonviolent resistance, which Jesus spelled out even more in, some of those famous cliches that get to, turning the other cheek, or, giving someone the coat off your back, or going the second mile, are actually all in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. They're all cliches in our, even still in our culture today, but they're all from the Sermon on the Mount about how to resist violence and oppression non-violently, but still actively resisting them. And subverting them.
But doing it with an attitude of love. And this is the amazing thing that Martin Luther King, said repeatedly. He said, you actually need to resist in a way that actually wants the best for your enemy, that shows a love for your enemy, not to overcome him, not to beat him, but to actually, invite him to join you, so that both you and he or she, will be better people at the end of the process. Yeah,
and that's it. And that's such a, to me, that's a faith that I can get excited about. And, again, you rest your weight on it. You start trying it in some practical ways in your life. And, rather than the big theory of the chair, we're simply just, does this work? Can we sit on it and experience this and actually live it in our lives in a practical way, rather than, the article you referenced, the other article you referenced that I wrote is talking about how for the first 300 years of Christian history, when Christians were teaching new believers, they were teaching them practical ways to live. They weren't teaching them so much philosophies and theories and theologies and doctrines. They were much more saying, this is a way to live in the world that is different. Yeah. And that, to me, that excites, because we look around the world and, yes, we need a different way to live in the world that is different. But you see those glimpses throughout history that actually do work, and that's kind of exciting.
Wow, it is exciting. And look, I could keep going for another half an hour on this and exploring this, but I think the point is really well made, Nathan, that, faith in the end is about, trusting the weight of your life on it to sort of test it and see whether it's the real deal or not. So thank you so much for that challenge and for writing the article, and certainly encourage our listeners to check that out at our website, signsofthetimes.org.au. And thanks so much, Nathan Brown, for being with us today.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.